UNO has always been an expanding university, constantly moving forward. But as we move forward, we must also look back to where we began. Let's go back in time with the people who remember UNO the way it was. Join us for Reflections in Time.
It's a fall, actually a fairly wintry day here on our campus at UNO in the fall of 1990 or early November. And we're here, I say we because I have a guest with me, to do another in the series of tapes that we call Reflections in Time. Over the past 8-9 years, I've been trying to visit with a great variety of people from our staff and our faculty, our administration, other people, who have spent a lot of time and or contributed a lot to the life and breadth of this university. And today is certainly no exception. I have with me Dr. Wayne Wheeler, a sociologist by trade who has been at the university for lots of years. Just recently, in this fall of 1990, he came back from time in Europe, and we'll ask him about that a little later. First of all, Wayne, I'm glad you could come and visit with me.
Thanks, Paul. It's always great to be with you. You know, we've known each other for years and years.
For lots of years.
Yeah.
But you know, in all that time, Wayne, I don't think we ever got to talking about things other than university-related matters, and I'd like to go back first, well beyond that, to early life for you.
Okay.
Where do you hail from, and a little about your family, that sort of thing.
Well, actually, I have an interesting family and personal history. I was born in Crete, Nebraska.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Close to Omaha, really.
Yeah. And I grew up there until World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get into that later. Actually, growing up in Crete, I had an extremely varied childhood.
Oh, did you?
And I've always thought of it as having been a happy childhood because, of course, in pre-World War II, that was a kind of a quiet time. Everyone had something to do. Our family was especially fortunate because my father, unlike many others, continued to be employed all that time. So while times were tough, we never went without something to eat.
Yeah, it was a tough period for lots of families, wasn't it?
Yeah. But as far as my family is concerned, I'm rather unique as far as the history of Nebraska is concerned because I myself am a fourth-generation Nebraskan.
Oh, is that?
And there aren't a lot of those around.
No, I wouldn't think so.
And my daughters, who graduated from the Omaha schools, would be fifth-generation Nebraskans, but they're both on the West Coast now. Those were times which and my family background, my ancestral background, would be another story in itself. But the growing up in Crete as I did, and given my interests and so on, I knew, although it was rather unusual for the time, that I would be going to college.
Mm-hmm. Did your family encourage this?
Well, as a matter of fact, my father was definitely against it.
Oh.
And that led to a lot of conflict, but we reconciled before he died in the early 1950s. But he couldn't understand and he was carrying a big burden himself. Mm-hmm. But I was lucky. I was encouraged by a lot of people, and of course I was the first one in the family to, and for generations, to even graduate from high school, let alone to go to college. But
it was not the usual thing.
No, it wasn't. And then I was also fortunate because I could start attending Doane College and continue some of the jobs that I had had during high school.
So that blended right in because it was
Yeah.
a hometown college.
Right. hmm And then I was there a couple of years, and World War II started.
Did that, while your time there at Doane, did that start to develop your interest in the sociological
Well, as a
aspects
matter of
life?
fact, I attribute my interest in sociology to the fact that I grew up in Crete, because in the first instance, I was a member of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant minority in a Czech Catholic community, and that gave me a kind of the outsider's view. And then in the second instance, one of the jobs I had was, one of a number of jobs was delivering newspapers. So I was all over town, all times of the day and night, making observations. And then when I started to work in regular employment in the summers, I worked first for the Crete Mills, which was locally owned at the time, one summer, and had experience with a work crew and a construction crew and truck driving and all that sort of thing. And then another summer I worked for the what was then the Fairmont Creamery, and so on. That's where my dad worked. He was a well, in modern terms, he was an unskilled laborer, but actually he was doing something fairly important in the way that the agricultural produce was processed at the time.
Well, so your early background involved lots of work too. You learned.
Oh yeah, I was working all the time.
Manual labor was a common thing, and part of your family, especially with Dad.
Yeah.
But you wanted to go to college and had a chance to do it and did.
Yeah. The first thing that gave me a boost on that was you know, I must, without too much modesty, say I was a pretty good student in high school, and I had a lot of encouragement from my teachers. And then my grandfather, believe it or not, when I was very young, I don't know how he got started on this, started calling me professor. And I think that probably became imprinted in my mind.
That helped too.
Yeah, and then the first scholarship I got was from the World Herald. I was one of the recipients of the first World Herald Carrier Scholarship.
Oh, for the
the very first year.
Yeah.
I think there were probably about 10 of us at the time, and so that paid for my tuition the first year.
Oh, that was a good hunk in those days.
Yeah, at that time.
Oh, yeah. What year would that have been about? Do you recall?
The scholarship?
I
got the scholarship in '39, and I started Doane in '41. I got it as a junior in high school.
Well, now, your college career was interrupted, wasn't it, because of service?
Yeah, it was. See, I went into the service
like so many of us.
In 1943, but here again I was fortunate because, or unfortunate as the case may be, I was called to active duty. I had, quote, volunteered for the Marine Corps, and I was called to active duty, and they sent me on to school for about, well, altogether it turned out to be about 12 months.
Oh.
So
that contributed to your degree program?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that gave me a degree before I went to Paris Island. And then after the war, I was fairly fortunate. I'd always known that I would go into education, and higher education.
Any special reason that you'd really decided on that long since, you might say, when you were a young man?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm lazy. But
mustn't let your colleagues hear that.
Well, the younger ones don't have to have the flexibility and and the right to relax like we could. And besides that, I was interested in ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in ideas, and I was interested in people, and I was interested in the variation of that exists among societies, and so forth and so on. But let me make one important point here. I always knew that I would continue through to get advanced education. Maybe I hadn't defined it in terms of a doctorate. But of course, the GI Bill of Rights was just remarkable for me.
Wonderful thing.
Yeah, it was probably one of the best things that ever happened in the history of the United States.
Amen.
And because it that and the interstate highway system brought the United States into the 20th century, and then and prepared it for being a modern society.
Anything special happened during the war that was of interest?
Well, actually, I went to Parris Island, where I went through boot camp and was a DI, and that was really the end of it. I was no war hero, except you know, the old story about what did you do during the war, Daddy? Well, the answer, of course, is I lived. And I often think of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Those
Well, the service life in one way or another always affects us, though.
Yeah.
It's the discipline and the difference
That's
in lifestyle
right.
that you acquire for
Yeah.
at least a few years.
Yeah. Sometimes people say, oh, I knew you were an ex-Marine, and sometimes people will say, my God, a person like you, been in the Marine Corps, so they don't know how to assess me, whether I'm soft or tough.
Well, after that time spent at Parris Island, the war is over, or at least your time in the service. What happened then?
Well, I came back to Nebraska. My parents had left Crete by that time because of the disruptions of the war. Came back to Nebraska and lived in Lincoln, and started to work for the State Historical Society in a museum there.
Oh, did you?
And then started to the University of Nebraska, and eventually got a master's degree at Lincoln.
A combination of work and study took you through that?
Well, actually, as time passed with the GI Bill and that sort of thing, I guess I worked for a fair length of time for the Historical Society, but I don't think I did it all the time, nor full time. I don't quite remember the details.
Well, with the GI Bill, that wasn't always necessary. That took care of us in pretty good shape.
Then, after I got my master's degree, by the way, I did it on for a thesis, I did a social stratification class study of Crete.
What? Your hometown?
Yeah. And that was rather a pioneering study for that sort of thing at the time, and had quite a bit of influence in the field of social class in sociology.
Find some interesting things about your hometown that you haven't been aware of?
Yeah, quite a bit. Yeah, yeah. I've always wanted to either redo it or write a new preface, a new epilogue to it, but I never have. But then after I got my master's degree, I went out to, by the way, I got married about that time, and went out to New Mexico and taught in eastern New Mexico what was then college for 2 years.
Oh.
And then after that, I went to the University of Missouri to get my PhD.
Decided to do doctoral work.
Yeah, well, I knew I would, but I wanted the teaching experience before I.
Sure.
And besides that, teaching was the best way to learn anything. And so then at the University of Missouri, I continued to have the GI Bill, and I had a teaching assistantship, really what in those times was called a half-time instructorship, and that, you know, got me through. And then I had a student in one of my classes. Oh, by the way, the Marine Corps had sent me to Gustavus Adolphus College.
Oh, from Minnesota.
Yeah, and I had taken Swedish language there.
Oh, yeah.
So I had begun to learn Swedish, and besides that, one of my grandmothers had lived among Swedes in Nebraska at one time. So, after I'd finished all my coursework for my PhD at Missouri, I had in one of my classes a Swedish exchange student who brought me an announcement one time of a scholarship provided by the Swedish government for Americans, and I applied for that and got it. So I went off to my then wife and I went off to Stockholm, where I studied for a year at the University of Stockholm, and studied Swedish culture and language and politics and society and so forth.
Well, that added another dimension to
it did.
Your relationships with people.
Yeah, and it gave me a kind of a love-hate relationship with Sweden for the last 40 years. But I don't know whether in your introduction you mentioned that and now since I'm on partial retirement, I do go to Sweden and teach every fall.
I mentioned that you just came back, but that's where you've been. Huh?
Yeah, that's where I've been. I've been there 2 years now.
Just a little aside about your retirement.
They want me to come back next year. So,
notice any great differences in life and?
Oh yeah, that's one of the fascinating things.
And you were there earlier.
Yeah. Well, of course, I've been going. I've probably been in Sweden 12 or 15 times
is that right?
over the years.
And you've noticed some changes?
Yeah, quite a few.
In government and other things?
Everything. I'm not quite sure this is the time to go into it, but besides that, there isn't enough time on the tape or the rest of the day or week.
You came back, and where do we go from here?
And then, interestingly enough, after my first year in Sweden, I came back and for my dissertation, which I had not finished at that time, I moved out to Lindsborg, Kansas, and did a community study there.
Oh, on the
of the Swedish community.
Yeah, that's a very Swedish community, isn't it?
Yeah. And
the school there
is Bethany College.
Yeah,
Bethany College. And then I was there a couple of years doing that work, and eventually ended up in Kansas City at Park College in Parkville, Missouri, where I taught for 4 years. And then then Bob Havighurst from the Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago called me out of the blue. He'd known about my stratification work, and he was interested in stratification. I think I pointed out that it had quite a bit of influence and was fairly well known at the time. He called me out of the blue once and asked me to take over the director's job of the research project that the University of Chicago was carrying out in Kansas City. So I did that for 3 years.
So you spent about 7 years in Kansas City or more?
Altogether, I think that's approximately correct, maybe 7 or 8 years. And then from there, I was offered and took a position at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
Oh, went south.
Yeah. And
university.
Yeah. That's when it was becoming a university from an institute and an engineering school.
Yeah, it was quite a
right.
development. That would have been approximately what year?
Well, that would have been in 61 or thereabouts.
Okay.
And then, no, maybe it was 63, but it's in the early 60s. And by that time we had our 2 daughters and a couple of years in Houston, convinced me that that wasn't the place for them to grow up. And then besides that, all of our families were here. My wife was from Ainsworth originally.
Oh, so you were Nebraska back in the period,
my daughters simply weren't learning who their grandmothers were, their grandparents, and so on. So now I know you haven't asked it here during this formal interview, but you asked me before, why did I come to Omaha?
I'm wondering, I was about to get to that now.
Yeah, well, this is a good time to talk about that.
All right, let's get there.
And that is, while I was still at Park College, Ed McCurtain called me.
Remember him well.
And as a matter of fact, I'd kind of forgotten this, he called me and insisted that I come for an interview to what was then Omaha University. And so I said, well, Ed, I'm perfectly happy where I am. He said, but you come up. And so then they were going to pay my expenses and everything, and there wasn't well, it was just common courtesy not to, after the first resistance, not to come. Well, I came here, and of course at that time the interviews were conducted by Mabel L and his array of factotums, and then I, quote, passed because Ed offered me a job. You know, Ed called me in a few days and offered me a job. And this is what I'd forgotten, what had slipped my mind. While I was making up my mind on that, that very time is when Bob Havighurst called to ask me to take over the University of Chicago research in Kansas City. At that very time. Besides that, I had some misgivings about coming to Omaha, and I'll tell you exactly why. Because they became very significant in what I did here when I finally did come. And that is, at that time, the ordinary teaching load was 15 hours a week.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
And they were not on TIA CREF, retirement. And then, of course, even at that time, they were having the problems getting the financial support from the community. And then I recognized, although I guess those matters became much more important to me later in my life, I recognized that Mabel L was pretty authoritarian. And
that was easy to grasp,
because instead of negotiating with Ed McCurtain, I was negotiating with him. Yeah, but he was certainly decent to me in all of our relations. You know, maybe he was able to be that way, and I was able to say that because they never did become very important. But then, at another time, and I can't quite remember when this occurred. I think it was when the Kansas City research was winding down, 3 years later, Ed McCurtain called me again and insisted that I come for another interview. And at that time, I was definitely in negotiation with Rice University to go there. Well, I thought Rice would be and some of the same things were still present at Omaha University that had caused me to be reluctant previously.
First time,
yeah, although the salaries themselves would have been better. But then Rice convinced me to, made me an even better offer than OU could make. And besides that, I wanted to see some more of the country and so forth.
So we went to Texas.
Yeah, we went to Texas.
4 years there.
But then when I was in Texas, by that time, Ed was leaving UNO
Yeah, he went to Missouri.
Yeah, he went down to Drury College in Missouri.
Correct.
And he wanted me to succeed him as chair of the department here.
Well, he kept after you, didn't he?
Yeah, he sure did. So that was my second offer here. But when I turned that down, they hired George Helling.
Oh, yeah.
Who came from Minnesota.
From St. Olaf College.
St. Olaf College. And then, after I was there, maybe in my second year at Rice, George Helling began this barrage of inviting me here. Well, by that time, the merger was about to occur. And so I knew the fringe benefits would be different, and the teaching load was dropping.
Was that an attraction to you now?
Yeah, and then getting out of Houston was also important.
Yeah.
So I came here, and at that time, I essentially had 4 jobs here, only 2 of which were officially recognized. George Helling was going off on leave to Turkey, so I was acting head of the Department of Sociology. But he, of course, George was not the greatest administrator in the world. And I think probably one of the reasons that he wanted to go to Turkey was because there were 3 open positions in the sociology department.
Wow. A lot of filling
and he hadn't had any success recruiting anyone, you see. And he knew that I was well enough known through my work in the Midwest Sociological Society and in Kansas City Research and so forth, so that I'd have a little bit of leverage on that. So essentially, I was being head of the department. I was spending hours and hours recruiting, sending out notices and having people in for interviews and things like that. And by the way, that recruiting effort eventually became the basis for what I call the modern Department of Sociology at UNO, because at that time Bob Harper, who was dean, and Kirk Naylor, who was president, were willing to give me benefit of the doubt when I just told them we had to do certain things in order to get people into sociology. So, and of course all the salary negotiations and everything were entirely personal. They weren't regularized, and whatever a person could get, you could get in those days.
Yeah, it was very easy going in that regard, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, of course the negotiations were pretty hard.
Sure.
But I knew with the merger coming up, I came before the merger, of course, I knew that the situation would change and it would be harder to, and I knew if there's going to be a sociology department worth having, that it'd be up to me to do it, to get these people in. So I recruited people to fill the 3 empty lines in the department, and then I convinced them to give me a 4th line. And so essentially I hired 4 new people, and one of them has since left, but the 3 people I hired, with the help of George Barger and Elaine Hess, we were really the nucleus of the department. Of course, Phil Volt was here, but he was in social welfare and so forth. So it was a little bit different situations. Phil was always very supportive of me, mostly because we're both Nebraska eccentrics. But so those 4 people, and then the 3 people who are still here and who became continuous are Bob Simpson,
Mm-hmm.
who came from St. Louis, Bill Clute, who came from Minnesota, and Mark Rousseau, who came from University of North Carolina, and so on. So we essentially, that group became the basis for the department.
And they've been here lots of years.
Yeah. Yeah. So then I was going to go back to the other jobs I had. Well, George, and I still think this was one of the reasons he left the country, George had also arranged for the annual meeting of the Midwest Sociological Society to be here in Omaha at the old Fontanelle Hotel. Well, I had been secretary and secretary-treasurer of the Midwest Sociological Society when I was in Kansas City for a few years, and I had been through the business of local arrangements with various people and so on and so forth. So the third job I had was making arrangements for the annual meeting of the Midwest Sociological Society and getting the touching base with the Chamber of Commerce and the Nebraska Employment Service and the hotel, and making sure that everything was...
George left you with a lot of folders on the desk.
Yeah, he did. But of course I realized this at the time, and there was the fourth folder that we haven't even mentioned yet, because I mentioned one formal job. My other formal job was what was then coordinator of urban studies.
I remember the term.
Yeah, coordinator of urban studies. And I knew that I knew before I came that it wasn't a very well defined position. But one of the reasons George wanted me here is because they had had so much, there was a lot of minimally tension and empire building between him and Dave Scott in political science, public administration. And Dave Scott had brought Harry Reynolds to run that thing when the political science was dominant, or public administration was dominant. Well, I don't know what happened. Harry is a different kind of a person. And then when that wasn't working out for him, George decided it was his time to move, so he brought me in. So I was coordinator of urban studies. Well, coordination involved the dreams of an interdisciplinary program between sociology, political science, and public administration, geography, and economics. And that coordinator had to report both to Elton Carter as graduate dean and Kirk Naylor as president, and coordinate all those departments. And of course, Roy Steele was head of economics at the time. Dave Scott, who was in political science and public administration, and then the fellow in geography, Ed Shields.
Yeah.
Gordon Shields, that's right. They decided with the passage of time that it was time for them to make their move. And Kirk Naylor, he was trying to keep all these forces in balance, because he, of course, was pretty insecure in what he was doing, as became evident with the passage of time.
You got involved with campus politics in a hurry.
Yeah. Well, I could handle it because, 3 years in the Marine Corps and various experience at various things. But I just assumed that and I've always done this, although maybe people don't realize it. I've always assumed that people are persons of goodwill, and that that there's always a possibility of building a consensus. Well, of course, and I don't know about the people I've been talking about, but many people think of consensus building as a sign of weakness, and being the kind of person I am, I'm willing to try to build consensus for a long time, but I'm also not a very weak person.
Now, out of all this, eventually, after the merger, we got some other schools and colleges, didn't we?
Yeah. Eventually, you see. Well, eventually that became so strong, and I know exactly what happened, although no one's told me. The Roy Steele, Dave Scott, and Gordon Shields went to Kirk and said, "This is impossible," you know. And so the upshot of it was that I resigned that position because it was becoming rather untenable. And besides that, Dave wanted to come back in and make his move again. Well, and then after the merger, this is one of the really ironies of the whole thing. There was this restudy of the university and what its structure should be, and you mentioned other colleges in the university. Well, by that time, Varner was president of the university system, and the person he called in for a consultant on how to construct an urban university was none other but Homer Wadsworth from Kansas City, who was head of the Kansas City Association of Trusts and Foundations, and who, in a sense, was a very close friend of mine, although Varner didn't, and others didn't know it at the time. And Wadsworth ended by making this recommendation specifically that the College of Public Affairs and Community Service be one of the colleges, one of the new colleges, and out of that was constructed, was moved public administration, you see, and was constructed the what became the Center for Urban Affairs, or whatever it's called now.
Grew out of all of those things finally came together under that roof.
And the fellow who eventually became head of that, Vince Webb, had been one of our students in the sociology department. So, and of course it's spun off in its own direction now, and I've lost track of exactly where it is.
You know, you came in at an interesting time here at this university when we were in the throes of the merger. And in a way you came in as an outsider, so your perceptions of what it could do were probably jaded from other things. How did it seem to you when you came, the merger, and what it was going to affect?
I saw it as a tremendous, I almost said humongous, opportunity to build a class university and to do important things in Omaha and in higher education. I really did.
Do you think that's coming or come to be?
It's coming, but it really didn't get started right away after the merger, because there were too many fits and starts, and too many people with really archaic vested interests, and also, very frankly, there were people with limited vision, not only on the faculty but in the administration and so forth. As far as I'm well, of course, Kirk was a great dreamer, and And of course, I don't know, have you done an interview with him?
I have.
Yeah. And he had numerous very heavy pressures and pulls on him. And I'm not so sure but what he couldn't have brought it off if there hadn't have been some of these other tensions between Lincoln and Omaha.
It was a tough time during that adjustment.
Yeah. So he was trying to balance various forces. But the one person, and I've got to say this, the one person who really had vision was Bob Harper in Arts and Science. And he was always very sympathetic to me and to what I was trying to do. And I think it's important to get that perspective on the record. He was a scholar and a gentleman, and had a wide perspective. But there was too much baggage from the old municipal university, West Dodge High.
Hard to adjust.
Yeah.
Hard to adjust.
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, or not with that in mind, but just generally, in your years at the university, I imagine, along with the development of these things we just mentioned, like the College of Community Affairs and Public Service, other things stand out in your memory. People, for example. People are what the university is made up of.
Yeah.
And were there some people, Wayne, that you think of especially, fondly or otherwise, that really made their mark in your life in our time here at the university?
Well, of course, I've already mentioned Bob Harper, and I think very fondly of him. By virtue of the nature of the situation, there was a certain amount of tension between Kirk and me at one time, but after he ceased being president of the university, we have become cordial and really friendly with one another. We recognize that, you know, as the saying goes, time wounds all heals, and so and I haven't seen him in recent years, but I don't know. I guess one of the dominant impressions that I have of the university at that time and over the years was that under the Bale administration, anyone who showed the least bit of individuality drifted away. You know, there wasn't enough of the really intellectual ferment, freedom, and give and take. And I know I personally have been irritated and irritated many people, because I always thought of any university as being an intellectual community where people would argue ideas and experiment with ideas and ways of doing things and so forth and so on.
You know, since you came here, or at the time you came here too, I think of this as what you've just said. As far as the faculty and staff voice in University Matters under Dr. Bale, that was pretty thin.
Yeah.
But the AAUP and other things, you might talk a little about that, because you've been involved in a lot of the think process there.
That's right.
Wayne, and how that has developed well, hasn't it, really?
It has. There are all kinds of dysfunctional consequences of the coming of AAUP that we don't need to go into here. For one thing, AAUP has, in my estimation, contributed to the bureaucratization of the university and the regulation by rule and governance by book, and it's really has a. But that was coming anyway with the growth of the university and the development of the colleges and the deans who are more administrators and bureaucrats than they are scholars.
Do you feel as we've grown and changed that it's just generally and very simply been harder to get some things done?
Well, for those who want to do them, they eventually get things done. It's amazing how much is done. It's amazing how much is done. I think the university has become a good, solid thing. But I wanted to say a word about AAUP because I've been both active and inactive in it. And as a matter of fact, I was always sympathetic to AAUP and was one of the leading picketers when the picketing went on. But I was never a member of AAUP. And I purposely refrained from membership because I recognized that to join something like that would, in a sense, restrict my freedom. And I think scholars should be free. That if they're not free, then they're nothing. And that's what I object to, the development of the increased bureaucratization of the university.
As we grew, though, wasn't some of that almost inevitable, though?
Yes, it was inevitable. It definitely was. But I think that, given my observation of and experience in other universities, through my profession and having taught or been on campuses and talked with people, I think there are ways of building in more intellectual ferment in an institution than the tradition and customs of the old Omaha University, so-called West Dodge High, allowed. And while we're drifting or moving away from that, I'm afraid the heavy hand of history and tradition still weighs heavily in this university.
A lot to be done in that regard as far as you're concerned.
Yeah, and I don't see that it'll ever be done in a to bring a top-notch intellectual community to the university, because the university has a certain kind of a mission and is doing well. But with the bureaucratization of, say, merit and promotion and that sort of thing, there are only certain very narrow definitions of what is scholarly.
Sort of a lockstep arrangement.
Yeah, it is. It's too much that way for a university.
You know, we're down to our last few minutes, 10 minutes or so here.
Well, doggone. Don't edit that.
No. And one thing I wanted to
I've only gotten started, Paul.
I know it. I know it. And one thing we ought to get to, the important part of this campus, along with our faculty certainly, are the students.
Yeah.
And here and other places you've done a lot of teaching.
Yes.
And I was wondering, and I'd be interested in your comment on the student profile.
Yeah.
As it was when you came here.
Yeah.
And as it is now in more recent years. You notice any changes? What about the good students as you reflect on them?
Well, that's very interesting. In my experience in the sociology department, it'd probably be best to limit my discussion there. We built a very solid graduate program leading to the master's degree. And for quite a few years, based upon that rebuilding of the department, we had a lot of very good students come through the department who may or may not have known much about sociology when they came into our area, but who learned a great deal of sociology as beginning graduate students, which, and I could name a lot of them, Trudy Henson, Gil Gillespie, Bob Francese, Herb Covey, Gail Miller, and on, who have gone on in sociology because they were given good solid foundation here, and they were motivated. They understood what sociology would and could be, and now they're doing important things all over the country.
And that's what helps make all of this worthwhile, isn't it?
Sure it is. Yeah, it is. And I've had contacts with some of them, and I'm almost embarrassed at what they quote of what I've said to them.
You didn't realize it was going to last
I didn't
that long.
realize they were paying attention or remembering.
They often surprise us, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. But it's you know, in the day-to-day life, a person isn't often aware of that. You have hopes, but and all these people and many others that I haven't mentioned remain good professional friends.
Now, one almost last question, I guess.
Yeah.
That is, if you had it to do over,
Yeah.
are there things about your life and your work and the things you've done that you'd want to change? Did you go down the road the way you're happy with it, or are there some things you've missed that you still want to do?
Well, I'm doing some of them by spending 6 months a year in Europe and teaching in Sweden. Basically, I would never have been anything but a sociologist. You know, even if I had to do it over again.
That's good.
I would still want to be a sociologist. I would want to, the only thing I would have changed as far as my profession is concerned, I would have wanted to be in a situation where I could be even more eccentric than I have been.
Who knows? That's time might still arrive.
I know. Well, and all that stems from my vision of what a university should be, of course. But from that point of view, I've been happy. I've been very happy with being in Omaha, in spite of all the pain that Omaha has inflicted. And the reason for that is, basically, I can't stand long, either time-wise or space-wise, rush hours. I like to be close to my work.
And this is the right size town.
That's right. And there's no place in the world that I can't be or haven't been starting from Omaha just in a few hours. And so I've always thought of Omaha as my home, Nebraska as my home. But I've always thought of myself as being a citizen of the world and having the wherewithal and the motivation and the interest to do things outside of Omaha.
Nicely said. It was great to have you here, Wayne.
Okay.
I appreciate your coming.
Sure.
Who knows, with all your part-time work and your trips to Europe, we may have to do a second chapter one of these days.
Anytime, Paul. Anytime I'm in the country.
All right. As you may have gathered, even if you started the tape a little late, we've been visiting with Dr. Wayne Wheeler, and he's been spending time with us, working with us on this series that we've been a part of for so many years called Reflections in Time.